The man who would become an atheist was raised in a world steeped in religious belief. His home was a small town where, like so many towns in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, a community of Jews lived among a majority of Catholics.
It is not easy to recall those early days. Only a few fragments reach into my memory. But of one thing I am certain. Deep within me there continues to live the happy child from Freiberg, the son of a youthful mother, the boy who received from this air, from this soil, the first indelible impressions.
The Freuds were a traditional Jewish family who lived in Freiberg, a distant outpost of the Austrian Empire. There, Jacob Freud traded in the wool business. Twice a widower when he met Amalia, they were married and had their first son in 1856. The young mother doted on the boy she called her golden child.
I have found that people who know they are favored by their mother give evidence in their lives of an unshakable optimism, which often seems like heroic attributes and brings actual success to their possessors.
For Sigmund, as for everyone at that time, religion, education, and family were woven together.
I was still a young boy when my father started to teach me to read, using the Bible to instruct me in both German and Hebrew of our ancestors.
Freud had a very close relationship with his father. He was home instructed, probably till almost the age of 9. And as he wrote later, Freud became very immersed in the Bible and in studies of the Bible. He identified with significant figures in the Bible. I'll just mention 2 that were very important. One was Joseph, who interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, and Freud later became the interpreter of dreams. The other one was Moses, a very powerful identification with Moses. I think he saw himself as a kind of modern Moses, bringing a new understanding to humanity.
The young Sigmund felt the strong emotion of faith from his nursemaid, a devout Catholic.
My nanny was an elderly but clever woman from the town who told me a great deal about God Almighty and hell. She took me to church. When I got home, I would preach and tell my family what God Almighty does.
He lost the nanny abruptly. He was told that she was caught stealing, supposedly from him, a story that to me is not believable. Something else must have happened, but we don't know what. The story he was told is that she was sent to jail for 10 months. He was quite desperate about her disappearance. He turned to his father as someone to help him and be with him, replacing the companionship, affection that the nurse had provided for him. However, catastrophe happened once more.
The branch of industry in which my father was concerned collapsed. He lost all his means, and we were forced to leave Freiberg and move to Vienna.
So they changed from this little town in which they had a comfortable, good enough life, accepted, respected, to the ghetto of Vienna. And there the father was unable to earn a living. And from that moment on, they had poverty.
The one hope in this new, diminished life was their gifted son, Sigmund. But his future presented a dilemma. Jacob Freud wanted to maintain his son's religious heritage, yet he also wanted him to succeed in the secular world outside the ghetto.
His father hired a tutor, and that tutor gave him some rudimentary lessons in biblical Hebrew so he could read prayers. In retrospect, he sees this as a kind of a part of his secularization, because the man who teaches him, a man named Hammerschlag, is in point of fact a secular Jew. And Freud becomes a great friend of the family as he grows up.
A spark from the same fire which animated the spirit of the great Jewish seers and prophets burned in Hammerschlag. Religious instruction served him as a way of educating the young toward love of the humanities. He made Jewish history flow out far beyond the limitations of nationalism or dogma.
Sigmund easily won admission to secondary school. There, he would enter a whole new life.
The second half of the 19th century is distinguished by the war between science and religion. That was not always the case. Newton was a deeply religious man. Kepler said, "I think your thoughts, O God."
The more and more natural phenomena were explained in a scientific way rather than supernaturally, the more religion felt threatened. And I heard one clergyman say that belief in miracles began to subside with the invention of the electric light bulb. That let there be light.
The new teaching captivated his imagination.
I felt an overpowering need to understand something of the riddles of the world in which we live, and perhaps even to contribute something to their solution. I came to know all the fields of science, but to which of them would I choose to dedicate my life?
Freud's mentors were from the new world of science. In the early 1870s, scientists were trespassing on the traditional domain of religion. This rebellion against the established order appealed to the young, ambitious Sigmund Freud.
Freud enters into the university at a point where materialism, the notion that our bodies are collections of chemicals and chemical processes, has been victorious. The body now becomes something mechanical that can be understood through science, through lab science. I mean, this is a world in which realities of the body are at the center, not the metaphysics of the spirit.
The theories of Darwin, which were then of topical interest, strongly attracted me, because they held out hopes of an extraordinary advance in our understanding of the world.
He's a very smart guy, and he's reading the hot philosophers of the late 19th century. He reads Feuerbach, he reads, or at least learns about Nietzsche. They argue that human beings have to be understood as biological entities in the world.
Freud's passion was science. But the material world didn't replace his old love of the humanities. Along with biology and mathematics, he also chose a class on religious belief given by the philosopher Franz Brentano, a former Catholic priest.
Brentano demonstrates the existence of God with as little bias and as much precision as another might argue the advantage of the wave over the emission theory.
Franz Brentano is one of the cult figures at the university when Freud is studying. He's a guy who has this kind of charisma that we associate with the great teacher. Brentano's philosophy is, in point of fact, a kind of a throwback philosophy. It's a philosophy that is, to be simplistic about it, romantic in its attempt to tie up every aspect of the universe.
I hope that In the end, you will all be more persuaded that a casual study of philosophy leads us away from God. But to delve more deeply into it is to be led back to Him again.
I have not escaped from his influence. I am not capable of refuting the simple theistic argument that constitutes the crown of his deliberations. Indeed, I am making a thorough study of his philosophy. Meanwhile, I reserve judgment as to the question of theism and materialism.
Freud, not only with Brentano, but with others, and especially within himself, contemplated and reflected upon the whole question of the proof of the existence of God, or the converse, disproving the existence of God. He came to the conclusion that it was not possible to definitively prove or disprove God's existence because it is not really a scientific question.
Faced with the material world and the spiritual, Freud made his choice.
I found rest and satisfaction in the physiological laboratory of the great Ernst Brücke. For 6 years, through painstaking study, I learnt the importance of observation in science. This was the foundation of everything.
Through the end of the century, there are all sorts of major discoveries about the mechanics of the nervous system, and Freud is right in the middle of that. Freud's a neurologist. He learns how nerves work. When Freud goes off and studies the nervous systems of primitive animals, he's doing cutting-edge work.
But his years in pure research ended in disappointment.
My teacher strongly advised me, in view of my bad financial position, to abandon my theoretical career. I followed his advice, left the laboratory and entered the general hospital, where I became a junior resident.
Freud is establishing himself as a physician. He wants to be a professor, but this is really difficult. He's going to have to establish himself, but as somebody who's going to have a practice dealing with sick people. So on the one hand, he's got this professional moment, and this is the moment when young men decide they're going to get married.
Freud had met Martha Bernays, a young woman from a distinguished and deeply religious Jewish family, and they fell in love.
If today were to be my last on earth, and someone asked me how I had fared, he would be told, I haven't been happy simply because of the anticipation of one day having you to myself, and of the certainty that you love me.
Freud worked hard to save money while he courted Martha. They waited for 4 years. But when they finally married, Freud would not allow Martha to practice her faith in their household.
Freud sees himself as Jewish, not religiously as Jewish, but ethnically as Jewish, and he wants to have someone who is compatible to that construction. The trade-off is that in their home, after the marriage, ritual is simply not practiced.
Freud's rejection of religious belief was not just a rejection of Judaism. It was a rejection of what he considered to be a belief in the supernatural, in magic and mysticism, which he regarded as something quite apart from being realistic.
Science asserts that there are no sources of knowledge of the universe other than carefully scrutinized observations, in other words, what we call research. And alongside it, no knowledge derived from revelation, intuition, or inspiration.
To the young Viennese neurologist, religion could not explain the complexity of the human condition. This problem led him to the most critical insight of his life and his work.
Freud gets a fellowship to go to Paris, and he's going to go to Paris to work on neurological diseases of children with the man who is the world's greatest expert, a man named Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot is working with hysterics. That is, people who have physical symptoms that don't seem to have a physical cause.
What Charcot demonstrated to Freud was that he could induce symptoms through hypnosis that mimicked and mimed the same symptoms the hysterics showed without hypnosis. So he could induce paralysis, convulsions, blindness, and it made Freud realize there were mental processes that go on very significantly outside of conscious awareness.
He puzzled about hypnosis. How is it that I can affect a human being's mind without his consciousness? What goes on here? That there's a powerful influence without the knowledge and the cognition of the patient.
Freud returned to Vienna convinced that neurotics could be treated with hypnosis. Then he went a step further. Through experimentation, he found he could get the same result simply by letting his patients speak in free association. No one had tried that before.
It's important to understand that Freud is trained as a materialist neurologist. A neurologist deals with people who are ill, who come into the office and say, I am not feeling well. And the doctor says to them, where does it hurt? And they go, it hurts right here. The psychiatrist at this point is running asylums. He is not dealing with individual patients. He is dealing with mentally ill people as a group. The psychiatrist doesn't talk to their patients because they assume they're crazy. They can't communicate.
By listening carefully to patients, Freud uncovered forbidden, often sexual feelings that the patient had repressed, which then made them sick. This discovery was so threatening to Freud's professional colleagues that they completely rejected him.
Word was given out to abandon me, for a void is forming all around me. This year, for the first time, my consulting room is empty. For weeks on end, I see no new faces, cannot begin any new treatments.
Deeply in debt, Freud struggled to support his family and his aging parents, who had never recovered from the failure of his father's business. But on Freud's 35th birthday, his father gave him the cherished family Bible.
Jacob Freud gave the Bible to him with a most moving dedication, composed into a very particular way of petitioning Freud to return to the Torah.
My dear son, in the 7th year of your life, the Spirit of the Lord began to move you and said to you, go read in my book that I have written, and there will be open to you the sources of wisdom, of knowledge and understanding. You have looked upon the face of the Almighty, have heard and striven to climb upwards, and you flew upon the wings of the Holy Spirit.
Each sentence had a profound biblical meaning and, at the same time, a profound personal meaning for his son, to whom he was addressing the dedication.
For the day on which you have completed your 35th year, I offer it to you for a remembrance and a memorial of love from your Father, who loves you with unending love. Jakob Freud.
He invited him to use the book again and to get the richness from the book, but Freud could not do it.
5 years later, Jacob Freud's long life came to an end.
The old man's death affected me deeply. I valued him highly, and he meant a great deal in my life. By the time he died, his life had long been over, but at death, the whole past stirs within one.
The death of his father was a nodal point in further launching Freud toward an introspective examination of his own internal feelings. It left him somewhat depressed, somewhat anxious, but also in a very analytic frame of mind.
In my inner self, the whole past had been reawakened by this event. I now feel quite uprooted. There is still very little happening to me externally, but internally something very interesting. I am led to my own dreams. As I fall asleep, involuntary ideas emerge, fermenting and simmering in me. Masses of bristling riddles lie round about. They lead me through all the events of my childhood.
Since Freud primarily wanted to be the explorer of the unconscious, he raised the question, how can I get access to it? What are opening windows to take a look into the unconscious mechanisms? And then he said, dreams. Dreams, while I'm not conscious, my brain produces a variety of images, pictures, and stories beyond my consciousness. So it must be within the unconscious. So the dream gives me access to the function of the unconscious.
The founder of psychoanalysis turned his new technique on himself. For 4 years, he carefully analyzed his own dreams, with startling results.
My libido toward my mother was awakened on the occasion of a journey during which we must have spent the night together, and there must have been the opportunity of seeing her nude. In my own case, I discovered that I was in love with my mother, and now consider it a universal event in early childhood.
Through his dream work, he recalled a scene with his father that revealed his childhood admiration and disappointment in this powerful figure.
My father began to take me with him on his walks and revealed to me his views on the world. One time he related to me a story that left a profound impression on my life, though not the one that he had hoped. He said he wanted to tell me how much better things for the Jews were now than before. Then he told me, "When I was a young man, I went for a walk in the streets of your birthplace. I had a new fur cap on my head. A Christian came up to me and knocked off my cap into the mud and shouted, 'Jew, get off the pavement.' I asked my father what he had done. He said, 'I went into the roadway and picked up my cap.'" This struck me as unheroic conduct on the part of the big, strong man who was holding the little boy by the hand.
The self-analysis revealed to Freud that he harbored ambivalent feelings toward his father. The feelings he had been aware of, respect, even veneration, love, admiration, coexisted with opposite feelings. They coexisted with feelings of disillusionment, disappointment, anger, resentment, and hostility. The hostility went so far as to include unconscious, before analysis, Freud was not aware of this, unconscious death wishes. He then began to understand that he also viewed his father as a rival for his mother's love. And that would lead us directly to Freud's analysis of the myth of Oedipus.
It is the fate of all of us to direct our first sexual impulse towards our mother and our first murderous wish against our father. Oedipus shows us the fulfillment of our own childhood wishes.
In that myth, Oedipus unwittingly, unknowingly, meaning unconsciously in our terms, marries his mother and kills his father.
With the Oedipus complex, Freud theorized that people have their own internal mythology, created from their earliest childhood experiences. He thought that religious beliefs were merely projections of our own fears and desires.
The child's attitude to the father is colored by a particular ambivalence. The father himself constitutes a danger for the child, perhaps because of its earlier relation to its mother. Therefore, it fears him no less than it longs for him and admires him. The indications of this ambivalence in the attitude toward the father are deeply imprinted in every religion.
What Freud saw was that our Father who art in heaven and our Mother who art in heaven were the idealized parents of childhood. So the Heavenly Father, the Divine Mother, for Freud became the king and queen of fairy tales.
God was the exalted Father, and the longing for the Father is the root of the need for religion.
Freud called religion an illusion. For over 30 years, he developed this idea in his enormous body of work. His first major book, The Interpretation of Dreams, was published in 1900, a book for the new century.
I completed the dream book. I was once again intoxicated with a hope that a step toward freedom and well-being had been taken.
The book flops. It falls on its head in a way that is unbelievable, because the medical scholars read this and say, it's nothing to do with medicine. The popular reception is virtually zero. Freud is desperate.
Not a leaf stirred to reveal that the interpretation of dreams had any impact on anyone. Understanding was meager. Praise was doled out like alms.
It takes an enormous amount of time to sell the first 100 copies of the book. But based on that book, Freud is now taken seriously in a subgroup in medicine and in culture in Vienna.
A group of followers, Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, Otto Rank, gathered around Freud and his work. The group gave themselves the name the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Within 20 years, there were dozens like it throughout the world.
The essence of psychoanalysis, of Freud's creation, is interpretation, reading symbols, understanding stories. It's this interpretive thrust, which I've always felt is so Jewish in Freud. Judaism is an interpretive religion, and psychoanalysis is an intellectual discourse which turns on interpretation.
From his work in The Interpretation of Dreams, Freud began to see that mythology reflected human history and human psychology too. On his desk, there was a collection of statues, heads, busts, figurines, ancient objects that had been dug up.
Freud imagined himself as the archaeologist of the soul. And so one of the things that he does is to think about this notion of the psyche as having levels, as being equivalent to the levels that the archaeologist digs through. But he also understood that those levels represented different civilizations, different stages of development of civilization. Religion is something that Freud sees as something that has to do with the archaic past of human beings. And these objects, these beautiful aesthetic objects, are also ritual objects.
He identifies in the language of religion and mythology terms that can be appropriated for scientific use. He retools pre-Christian Greek stories and sees them as oracles to the inner workings of humankind, and then arranges a scientific approach to understanding that phenomena within the structures of rationality.
Religions owe their compulsive power to reawaken memories of very ancient, forgotten, highly emotional episodes of human history.
I think that Freud decided, because of his analysis of myth, that many of the myths were in common. The myths about paradise, about expulsion from paradise, about immortality, about resurrection or rebirth, could be found in so many different societies and cultures, and in ancient cultures, that it made him think about how similar they were to many of the beliefs in current religions like Judaism and like the different branches of Christianity.
Freud tells the story of being brought to a church and being sort of overwhelmed by the spectacle. He tells this as an adult about a childhood memory. He tells other stories about the nanny also, about the seductive power of the nanny in terms of her belief, her piety. These stories Freud tells to talk about the pitfalls of religion. He doesn't like religious practice, so he says only a child would have been suckered by these candles and this incense.
Later in his life, Freud would bring all his thinking on religion together in the book, The Future of an Illusion.
Religion is the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. Like the obsessional neurosis of children, it arose out of the Oedipus complex, out of the relation to the father. Our God, reason, will fulfill whichever of our wishes nature outside us allows.
Freud claimed religion is an illusion, but our science is not an illusion. Darwin had shown us that we descend from monkeys, that Copernicus has said we are not the center of the universe, and Freud was saying, come down from your heights, human beings. You are not as great as you think you are. You have to save yourself from your delusions. You are full of sexuality. You are full of hatred and lust and envy. Face yourself. I am going to save you from those delusions.
In the first decade of the 20th century, Viennese society was all gaiety and glitter. This is how they wanted to be seen. But day after day in his practice, Sigmund Freud saw the other side of Vienna, people who were deeply unhappy and who did not know why.
Freud showed that humans are not masters in their own house, that to some degree we are ruled in an unruly way by unconscious forces outside of our awareness.
Psychoanalysis has taught us that our intellect is a feeble thing, a tool of our instincts, and that we are all compelled to behave cleverly or stupidly by the commands of our emotional attitudes.
For him, unconscious life is a dynamic life, is the repository of our experiences, of our wishes, of our needs, which have been repressed, which couldn't be acted upon. And he said there's nothing more important in his work than to say, I open up a new territory of man's existence, namely his unconsciousness. It is important, it is large, it influences everything we do.
What is more natural than that we should persist in looking for happiness along the path on which we first encountered it? Sexual love has given us our most intense experience of an overwhelming sensation of pleasure and has thus furnished us with a pattern for our search for happiness.
In 1905, Freud wrote a series of essays on sexuality. He stated plainly that sex, or the libido, drives our desires and impulses, whether we know it or not, and that this drive is formed early in childhood. Viennese society was scandalized.
He's accused of being a pornographer from day one. The accusation is that he's obsessed with sex. Maybe the problem that Freud has is that he should have chosen another word rather than sexuality. Sex for Freud is what we are as human beings. It is not simply genital sex. It's what underlies all relationships. But what he says is the drives are the ones, the underlying, can we say, amorphous, unshaped drives, are those things which, in a sense, morph into various forms of relationships. As an individual, we relate to other people, to our caregivers when we're infants, to our spouses. At the base of who we are as a human being is, in point of fact, the sexual drive.
We psychoanalysts are unable to see anything forbidden or sinful in sexual satisfaction. But it must be said, to believe that psychoanalysis seeks a cure for neurotic disorders by giving a free rein to sexuality is a serious misunderstanding which can only be excused by ignorance.
But Freud's theories were misunderstood. What most incensed the public was that Freud claimed that sexuality began at birth, not puberty. He was accused of violating the innocence of childhood.
When he spoke about infantile sexuality at the beginning, he spoke about genitality, step by step in our development, as the sexual component. Later on in life, he does not just speak about the body component pleasures and their impact on us, but he spoke about sexuality as an overall component which connects us together with affection and with the capacity to love.
The making conscious of repressed sexual desires in analysis makes it possible to obtain a mastery over them. It can be said that analysis sets the neurotic free from the chains of his sexuality.
When Freud says science wants to achieve that we are free of suffering and that we slowly learn to love thy neighbor, to be social. This is a condition which is difficult for us to achieve. So happiness is not something which is our aim. What he really said very often is, we want to be in a state of comfort, but we don't achieve it, but we want to be.
Although he was called a sexual libertine, in his private life, Freud was a typical straight-laced member of the middle class. He had 6 children with his wife Martha and found true pleasure in family life.
He was a typical pater familias. I think he took great pride and pleasure in his children. He said of his children, they're my pride and my treasure.
We are living rather happily and steadily growing, if modestly. The two boys, Martin and Ernst, are naughty and funny. Our Sophie is now becoming so beautiful.
When he was not seeing patients, Freud taught and developed his theories about people's deepest conflicts and fundamental needs. What he wrote about happiness was a definition of his own happiness.
One gains the most if one can sufficiently heighten the yield of pleasure from sources of psychical and intellectual work, such as the artist's joy in creating, or a scientist in solving problems, or discovering truths.
Freud would say that human beings have always been internally conflicted, and the internal conflict is between insatiable desires and prohibitions that are absolutely necessary for society to continue, and this leaves us in a state of unease, a state of dissatisfaction, and often in a state of wretched pain. And so rather than to look for another mythological intervention, that we need to accept our condition as it is, that we're perpetually conflicted, and then with the help of what he called the talking cure, we can change this wretchedness into ordinary unhappiness.
Freud saw human life drawn between two powerful and opposing forces. The life force on the one hand, and on the other, the death instinct. The destroying drive.
Let us look away from the individual to the great war that is ravaging Europe. Think of the excess of brutality, cruelty, and mendacity which is now allowed to spread itself over the civilized world.
Freud starts out in 1914, as, by the way, most people start out in Vienna in 1914, being a great supporter of the war. And by 1919, he is, as most people are in Vienna, aware of the horrors of what that communal response to the war really has brought. The death of an entire generation. A generation, by the way, in which his sons are part.
Two of my boys are still in artillery training. Martin is already in the trenches. Oliver left yesterday. I discharged a Russian patient as cured. 2 weeks later, he became my enemy who might, for all I know, shoot at one of my sons.
After the First World War, there's a very interesting kind of shift, which is that Freud, who in a sense had been always interested in the growth potential of human beings, suddenly becomes aware that there's a dark side to human beings. He writes a series of papers on what he calls the death drive, about the fact that we, in a sense, not only want to preserve our lives, but that we are always moving toward death. And suddenly he starts to understand evil not only as part of individual development, but also part of society.
These are indeed terrible times. It seems to us as though never before has an event destroyed so many precious possessions of our common humanity. Confused so many of the clearest intellects, debased the highest so thoroughly. This war has let the primeval man within us into the light.
The savagery of war propelled him to a deeper study of man's nature. In the years following the First World War, he brought together all his intellectual interests: psychiatry, history, mythology, religion, into one long essay: Civilization and its Discontents.
Civilization was based upon the fact that people were capable of regulating their instincts, regulating their most primitive, antisocial, anti-familial instincts. One could be jealous of a brother, one could want to have incest with a sister, but it was important that a regulated human being never act out such impulses. In fact, Freud at one point said, the person who first hurled a word, an insult, so to speak, instead of a spear, was the founder of civilization.
Civilization is perpetually threatened with disintegration. Instinctual passions are stronger than reason. Civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts.
Freud does not assume any sort of external moral world which is transcendental. He sees this as part of internal processes functioning in terms of the way that we set up laws.
In our view, the truth of religion may be altogether disregarded. Its doctrines carry with them the stamp of the times in which they are originated, the ignorant childhood days of this human race.
Originally, religious attitudes, faith in a supreme being, comes from the early parent relationship. The parent who helps the child towards self-regulation, towards self-control, the parent who teaches the child that certain impulses like to scratch, bite, kick, and so forth are not to be expressed and have to be controlled. The child's sense of what is right and wrong, what's acceptable and unacceptable, in Freud's terms, comes from what the parent approves of or disapproves of. But those relationships, for Freud, become internalized. So eventually the voice of conscience is from within. What's evil within us then is not the devil. The devil are the primitive passions and impulses within ourselves which threaten us from within, not from without. And when we say, "Get thee behind me, Satan," what is really meant, in following Freud's thought, is, I will not allow these passions to rule me. I will be master of my own passions.
It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. When once the Apostle Paul had posited universal love between men as the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance on the part of Christendom towards those who remained outside it became the inevitable consequence.
Freud saw his destiny to rescue human beings from their self-deceptions, their convictions that they were so great, so full of love, so full of self-knowledge, and to demonstrate to them that they were deceiving themselves, that they were dominated by sexuality, by passions, by anger, by hatred.
But there was another category of human misery not created by people, and against which there was no defense. In the great flu epidemic that followed in the wake of the First World War, Freud lost his daughter Sophie. She was 23 years old and pregnant with her third child.
It was a senseless, brutal act of fate which has robbed us of our Sophie. Tomorrow she will be cremated, our Sunday child. I do not know whether cheerfulness will ever call on us again. My poor wife has been hit too hard. Indeed, a mother is not to be consoled. And as I am now discovering, nor is a father.
3 years later, Sophie's 4-year-old son, Heinle, also died.
He was an enchanting fellow. And I know that I have hardly ever loved a human being. Certainly never a child as much as him. I find this loss very hard to bear. I don't think I ever experienced such grief. He meant the future to me, and thus has taken the future away with him. As the deepest of unbelievers, I have no one to accuse, and I know there is no place where one can lodge an accusation.
He said that there are other people that can be consoled by religion, but he doesn't have that available to him. And once more, he resorts to the same stance in relation to himself. He's going to hold himself up. He's going to tolerate the pain. He's going to tolerate the suffering without consolation. And that is what he has accepted. Life is hard, and he will take it.
My father is here with a very old friend of his. In this picture, neither of these two men knew that they were photographed. That is why the whole thing is so natural.
The 1930s would be the last decade of Freud's life. He already had cancer of the mouth, and he knew it would kill him.
My father and mother.
Freud's daughter, Anna, looks back at the family home movies.
This was at the time when we couldn't leave Vienna anymore in the summers because of my father's illness. And so we took a house in the suburbs, and my father enjoyed the flowers so very much.
He's an old man. He's extremely sick. He's had cancer for decades, and they've been cutting on him for decades. And he's got this huge implement in his mouth that's covering the opening in his palate so the food that he eats doesn't come out of his nose. I mean, he's in terrible pain all the time.
Freud knew that he was dying, and I think that led him again to consider the attitude towards death, which he had written about before, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death and so forth. And of course, concern with death, disappearances, run right through Freud's writings from the very beginning to the very end. He would even say to Ernest Jones, "Goodbye, Jones, you'll never see me again." So it was a preoccupation that he had. He was superstitious about the date of his death for years through his life. And I think that as death approached and became a reality, he again tried to understand what is the meaning of death. And of course, one of the wishes that's involved is a wish for immortality, a wish to not die, along with a wish to be relieved of the suffering, a wish to die. So I think that absolutely preoccupied him.
It is the day of my parents' golden wedding. And now you will see a whole string of visitors, people from the country, a little girl. This is one of my father's sisters, one of those who died in concentration camps. Meet Sie, Freud.
Hitler had been elected chancellor in Germany. When the Nazis started burning books, Freud's were among the first consigned to the flames.
Gegen seelenzersetzende Überschätzung des Triebslebens, für den Art der menschlichen Seele, Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften der Schule Sigmund Freud.
What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burnt me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books.
It was the tidal wave of anti-Semitism in Germany and elsewhere in Central Europe that brought Freud back to confront the historical phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Why was it such a continuous and pervasive poison in the history of the West?
In the summer of 1934, Freud began to work on the last book he would write, Moses and Monotheism. In it, he would turn his attention once again to religion, this time the Jewish faith.
Freud has a long affair with Moses. Long before his last book. He went to Rome. He spent days sitting in front of Michelangelo's Moses to study it. That this is not Moses in anger, but Moses in trying to restrain his anger.
Here was Freud arguing that much of what we identify as Israelite religion in the Torah actually is of Egyptian origin.
Moses was not Jewish, but a prominent Egyptian who led the Jews into freedom, and he gave them monotheism. In other words, it was not God the Father who chose the Jews, but Moses the man.
Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt into the desert. But then Freud departs from the Bible.
He gave himself a very interesting freedom. He says this is not a scientific study. It is a novella, a short story. I will try on some of my ideas and play with it.
In Freud's version, the Jews follow Moses into exile, but they do not accept his revolutionary new belief in just one God.
They revolted and threw off the burden of a religion that had been forced on them. They took their destiny into their own hands and did away with their tyrant. They assassinated Moses.
Moses' ultimate triumph is assured by the manner of his death. The people of Israel are overcome with guilt at what they have done, so they internalize everything that they had rejected while Moses was alive.
Freud goes on to reinterpret the crucifixion in terms of Jewish history.
Guilt has to be relieved. You can't walk around forever burdened by excessive guilt. So Christianity provides humanity with a way of relieving guilt. The murder of God's Son is a sacrifice that atones, not for the eating of the apple in the Garden of Eden, but for the murder of the primal Father. So Christianity offers relief from unbearable guilt. And Judaism rejects that offer of relief. The world repays Judaism with eternal hatred. That's Freud's deep-seated psychological explanation for anti-Semitism.
Freud is identified with Moses, who brings the commandments, who preserves the tablets of the law, and who brings not only a new set of regulations, but a new way of understanding human nature to humanity.
The thing that is most significant for a reader of the Bible or anyone who knows the story is that there is no God to tell Moses what to do. Like Freud, Moses tells himself what to do. he is his own man.
But historic events forced Freud to stop working on the manuscript.
Now this is already Hitler in Vienna. That's our house looked with the swastikas on it.
In March of 1938, the German army occupied all of Austria. They began the systematic persecution and deportation of Austria's Jews.
Oh, and that is the crowd cheering Hitler. Look at the crowd. That's how it looked.
It was an extraordinarily disturbed period. People were refugees on the move all over the continent. He clearly didn't appreciate the monstrous nature of the brutality that the Nazis had in mind. He didn't foresee that the burning of the books was a prelude to the burning of people.
Finally, Freud saw the danger and allowed friends to buy the visas that would permit him to leave with his family.
We are waiting more or less patiently for our affairs to be settled. In view of the little time we have left to live, I fret at the delay. Anna's youthful vigor and optimistic energy have fortunately remained unshaken. Otherwise, life would be difficult to carry on at all.
We left Vienna by a night train and spent a day of rest in Paris. My brother Ernst, who came to Paris to meet us. My father hoped to see something of Paris again, but he was too tired from the trip.
Here is a man facing death in exile, like Moses leaving Egypt. And he will not get into the promised land. He doesn't really believe that there is an afterlife. He faces death with an attempt again to review his own line of reasoning, the question of whether one believes or disbelieves in a paradise, in a heaven, a hell, in a life after death, in immortality. And he rejects all of that for him on the basis of the perpetuation of childhood fantasy into adult life. He thinks that this is not realistic and that one should face death stoically with a realization that that is part of life. It's the end of life. We do not know why it was designed this way, that life should come to an end.
Once established in London, Freud published Moses and Monotheism. The book outraged both Jews and Christians. Though old and sick, Freud was as defiant of his critics as he had been throughout his life.
He's in England. He is suddenly freed from all of the constraints of that public face that he had to present in Vienna. And he can do things that, in a sense, he wants to now do as a public figure. At the same time that he writes Moses and Monotheism, he writes an open letter in English against the persecution of the Jews. Does he do it as a Jew or as a scientist or as a psychoanalyst? At this point, he's all of them.
Now, this is definitely a birthday. It's the last birthday.
Freud usually wound the clock in his study. He had not. He was too sick. And Freud knew that his time was up. The end was very near.
Our unconscious does not believe in its own death. It behaves as if it were immortal. We cannot imagine our own death, and when we attempt to do so, we can perceive that we are, in fact, still spectators.
He faced a great deal of pain and suffering with as minimal treatment as possible because he was always concerned that it might interfere with his thought processes. He didn't want to be in a state where he might be logy, lethargic, dazed, unable to concentrate.
I cannot face the idea of life without work. Well, what will one do when ideas fail or words refuse to come? It is impossible not to shudder at the thought.
All of a sudden he has to come to terms with this new life, and he does it remarkably. I mean, it's an enormously productive moment given all of these other constraints. And his arrangement, of course, with his physician was that if he was no longer, this was an arrangement that went back to Vienna, he was no longer able to deal with the pain of the cancer, he would be given an overdose of morphine, which at some point he decides he actually needs.
My dear Shur, you remember our first talk? You promised me then you would not forsake me when the time had come. It is only torture now. It no longer makes any sense.
He had all his antiquities with him, all his gods that he talked to, and his personal intellectual life there with him. It is my personal conviction that the ghost of Moses, it was saying to him, come on, have the courage to get rid of God to the very end. And he died as self-possessed he has lived, not asking for consolation, not asking anyone to protect him, but simply dying as he had lived, with this kind of rebellious defiance and conqueror's stance.
That is when 3 men of the Royal Society came to present the book of the Royal Society for signature to my father, because he was not well enough to go there. And I think on that same picture is a signature of Darwin. That was a very nice moment.